President Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin are set to meet today in Anchorage, Alaska, with Trump still pushing for peace, but sounding more skeptical all the time that his Russian counterpart wants to stop the war that Russia started by invading Ukraine 3 years ago.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Gillian Melcher in London and columnist Kim Strassel. The Alaska summit is about to begin as we tape this, President Trump taking off on Air Force One around 8 a.m., accompanied by a coterie of U.S. officials, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, among others. President Vladimir Putin is set to land at about 11 a.m. local time, attending the summit along with aides, including Sergei Lavrov, the longtime Russian foreign minister. This will be Putin's first time in the United States since 2015, when he attended the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Trump and Putin this morning are reportedly scheduled for a one-on-one meeting with interpreters, a working breakfast, and then potentially a joint news conference. Here's part of what Trump said on Air Force One, talking about the killing of civilians, which is getting in the way of negotiations.
They're trying to negotiate. He's trying to set a stage. I mean, in his mind, that helps him make a better deal. It actually hurts him. But in his mind, that helps him make a better deal if they can continue the killing. Maybe it's a part of the world. Maybe it's just his fabric, his genes, his genetics. But he thinks that makes him, gives him strength in negotiating. I think it hurts him, but I'll be talking to him about it later.
On Thursday, President Trump said this: we're going to find out where everybody stands. He said if it's a bad meeting, it'll end very quickly. And if it's a good meeting, we're going to end up getting peace in the pretty near future, unquote. Gillian, given the timing, we don't have the outcome of this summit yet. And as unpredictable as Donald Trump is normally, get him in a room with Vladimir Putin, and I can only imagine that increases the unpredictability. But I'm hoping we can kind of set the table for listeners here. In the lead up to the summit, there have been news leaks, reports that part of what Russia wants is some land concessions of Ukrainian territory. How do you read those, and what is it that Putin seems to be asking for?
Yeah, well, I think to keep in mind in the back of your head before we start talking about the specific concessions, Vladimir Putin has said that he considers all of Ukraine his. And so that's what Ukrainians are certainly looking at. They don't believe that a ceasefire or a pause necessarily changes Putin's intentions. But when we're talking about ending the war, what he's talked about in the past is not only having the territory that he currently holds, but also Ukraine giving up additional territory that Russia does not control. And so it's an open question whether in these discussions he's going to propose that Ukraine surrender all of Donetsk and Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. Those are the four regions that have come up a lot. In recent days, there's also been talk that he just wants Ukraine to give up Donetsk. But I think that's really telling for his intentions here. And it's part of the reason why Ukrainians are so skeptical. And it's something that you might not know if you're not following the war on a granular level. But in Donetsk province, there's something called a fortress belt. And this is basically like 31-mile stretch that the Ukrainians have been heavily fortifying since 2014. And the Russians have been trying to bust through this, not just since 2022, but even earlier than that. And they haven't been able to. I mean, there's been fighting this week around Pokrovsk, which is not part of the fortress belt, a little bit further south. But that's something that it's only a city of like pre-war 60,000. It's taken the Russians about a year and a half to get close to closing in on that city. So when I'm looking at what the Institute for the Study of War said, they were looking at it and saying at the rate Russia's been going, for them to bust through this fortress belt that has stopped the Russians from rolling further west, it would take years. So the fact that Vladimir Putin is floating that as a potential idea, I think first of all suggests that his army is not as strong as he would like the West to believe it is. Second, it suggests that he wants that barrier gone, and I think that's for pretty sinister reasons.
And what's important to understand about that, Kim, is that at this point, there's nobody in Ukraine who would trust any kind of peace deal from Vladimir Putin, given his broken promises in the past. And that's why the Journal's editorial this week, leading up to the summit, was suggesting that what might be needed here is some kind of security guarantees for Ukraine. Because if part of this negotiation allows Russian forces to bypass the entrenched defensive line that the Ukrainians have set up, I mean, the thinking in Ukraine has to be that this is just Putin biding his time. And once he gets past that defensive line, he will just wait to build up his forces and figure out his ideal time to strike the next offensive, break the ceasefire, break whatever kind of peace agreement comes. Because, as Jillian points out, what he really wants is Ukraine as a vassal state.
Well, right. And look, I think people really need to focus on the stakes here. Not just, Jillian just laid out very well what Putin wants from this. And nobody should think that Putin wants peace. Putin wants Ukraine. He wants to reestablish a greater Russia. He wants Ukraine to be a vassal state, a puppet state, the way Belarus is at the moment. And that's his aim. And he wants to end up with a deal here that puts him closer to that aim. The only thing that will actually dissuade him would be losing the war or thinking he might lose political control at home. And for the Ukrainians, I think it's just important that people understand that giving up land for them, first of all, they don't trust anything Putin said, nor should they. He's broken so many promises over the years. You know, he's already signed 2 ceasefires and broke both of them. So why would they have any trust in what he says now? But there was recently a poll that Jillian cited in a great piece that she did from the International Institute of Sociology, saying that only 38% of Ukrainians would accept some land losses for peace, 52% firmly against territorial concessions, 68% oppose official recognition of Russian control of occupied territories, and 78% reject surrender of regions not currently under Russian control. That's what's at stake here, is that Ukrainians are worried, rightly worried, that the contours of this deal are going to not only lose them land, and it's not just land, but people, actual Ukrainians that don't want to be under Russian control, but that, you know, without security guarantees, it will only set the stage for Putin to go rolling through Ukraine and take even more. So there's going to have to be an enormous element to this. If there's any agreement whatsoever, in a perfect world, there won't be concessions to Russia for land at all. But if that were to happen, there has to be an enormous payback for Ukraine in terms of security guarantees that are very strong, and also economic aid and other promises that it will be able to stand on its own 2 feet if and when Russia were to break the rules again.
This piece that Kim mentions, Jillian, was in the Journal's op-ed pages. The headline, if listeners want to go find it, is "Ukrainians Face a Sophie's Choice." And it does, I think, get to the fundamental disagreement here, which is that Putin wants to lord over Ukraine and the Ukrainians don't want to be lorded over. And the opening of this piece, you talk about a Ukrainian who was working in New York City for Morgan Stanley. And when the invasion came, she's now serving as a combat medic in Ukraine. And that is the kind of fighting spirit that this invasion has helped unify Ukraine around.
Yeah, you're right. I'm thinking about this girl, this combat medic that I interviewed. 25-year-old girl, had a really bright future for her in New York City in finance. And she was saying, I can't, the only reason that I have a country to go back to is because I have family members who are willing to fight for it. I can't sit here and benefit. I need to go back. And when you talk to Ukrainians, they'll bring up the point, one soldier that I'd interviewed who was actually fighting in Mariupol, one of the toughest battles of the war, taken prisoner of war, was saying, we're not fighting for critical minerals. We're not fighting for land in and of itself. We're fighting for the people who live on that land. And we could give up land. We can't give up these people. And as I've been talking to Ukrainians about their understanding of the war and Russians, a lot of them reference this sort of Soviet mentality, Soviet past, because you have to remember their history is linked with Russia's, and it was not a good experience. They had the Volodymyr, which is the famine that the Soviet Union imposed, where millions of Ukrainians starved to death. They know what it's like to be forcibly taught Russian and have family members forcibly taken to other parts of Russia. And so I think that memory, that historical memory, is contributing to what they're thinking about. And I was asking them about, like, is this a choice between right and wrong? Is it a choice, if you're under Soviet occupation or Russian occupation, between wrong and wrong? And they were saying, absolutely, it's a choice between wrong and wrong. And that's kind of what Hannah Arendt observed the Soviet Union was doing to destroy people's morality, to force them in a situation where they were ready to be subservient and broken. And that was choosing between wrong and wrong. Like there's the book Sophie's Choice, where a mother in a concentration camp has to choose between which of her children survives. And it ends up in the novel totally breaking her. And I think Ukrainians feel like they're being put in a similar situation as we talk about territorial concessions, that it's not choosing, between war and peace. It's choosing between which of your territories, which of your family members are willing to give up. And I think they view that as not only an impossible choice, but an immoral choice that would ultimately destroy them. And I think that explains a lot of their reluctance to make that choice.
This view of what Putin wants, though, has long been pretty clear, I think, Kim. And that's part of why when Trump came into office in his second term, saying that he was going to get peace within 24 hours, it was, to my mind, a little bit mystifying. Does he not see what Putin is really after here? But it is notable that now we are a few months into Trump's term in office. He's been pushing for peace, and he seems clearly to be getting frustrated with Putin and to be taking a more hawkish line. One thing that is of note is these tariffs now, 25% on India in response to the purchasing by India of Russian oil. And here is the fact sheet on August 6th from the White House. It says, India's importation of Russian Federation oil undermines U.S. efforts to counter Russian harmful activities. By imposing a 25% tariff, President Trump aims to deter countries from supporting the Russian Federation's economy through oil imports and impose serious economic consequences on the Russian Federation for its ongoing aggressions. And there are more levers like that President Trump can pull if he wants to. There's this bill that has a supermajority of co-sponsors in the Senate. Lindsey Graham is a big advocate of it, that would do punishing tariffs on other countries that are buying Russian oil. And as far as I can tell, the Senate is basically waiting on Trump to say, I'm ready for you guys to pass that and I will sign it. So what do you make of the Trump administration's and the president's more hardline turn, I guess, given the rhetoric that President Trump used when he was coming into office?
That Trump shift is really notable, and it's just worth remembering the past 6 months, because memories can be short. We began this term, as you noted, Kyle, with Trump saying peace is going to come within 24 hours. He seemed to be caught up in his initial months with this faction of the party that was very much wanted out of Ukraine, wanted to wash its hands of it. Remember the horrific meeting between Zelensky and the president and J.D. Vance, which blew up. There was a lot of pounding on Ukraine, which I thought was utterly unnecessary and completely wrongheaded. But that's where we were. And then, interestingly, you had the anti-war faction, the kind of more pacifist or isolationist wing of the party, really began to try to exert itself over the president. And he really pushed back on this with regard to a number of hotspots in the world, including Israel, but also Ukraine, and said, he was going to make decisions. And you've seen since then him being a lot more realistic about the real problem here, which is indeed Putin. And as you noted, we've got this Indian sanctions that came up. And now we're having the summit. I think we should take the president at his word that he's kind of going there to feel out Putin and Putin's willingness to actually do something. And, there's a merit to that, I guess. Sometimes personal diplomacy, it really is about that. If you can get in a room with sometimes people are more willing to make concessions face to face than they would be over email, for instance, or via, their underlings who are negotiating with each other. There's a risk here, too, going into this when the outlines of a deal aren't actually clear, and there's a lot on the line. But if he comes out of it and he has decided that Putin really isn't going to do anything, and I think one risk here as well, too, is that Trump does not become the one who is lulled into concessions by Vladimir Putin in this meeting in a face-to-face. And that could be one of the reasons Putin's trying to make this happen, is so that he can try to get that land agreement he wants or something with false promises. But if he comes out of here and has decided that Putin is not legitimate, not serious, there are a lot of things. There's sanctions that can be put on China, much like we just did with India. There's that Senate sanctions bill, which is sitting there essentially waiting to go. There's the possibility of working with Europe to confiscate some $300 billion worth of Russian reserves that are sitting in the West. There's a lot of ways to put a lot of economic pressure on Putin. And then similarly, there are a lot of ways to amp up arming and helping Ukraine as well, whether that's directly through the U.S. or via transfers that are made to Europe, which then make their way on to Ukraine. There's a lot of ways to do this. I think Jillian has pointed out that Putin's projection of his force is probably greatly magnified over the reality of what it really is. And we don't know what his domestic situation is, but there are tolls that are being taken on Russia for this war as well, too. And if those were increased, that might be something that changed the dynamic.
Jillian, what's your view of the president's shift here and the leverage that he could exert if he comes out of this meeting and decides that Putin isn't serious? I mean, notably, President Trump at one point set a specific deadline and said, I'm going to ratchet up sanctions on Russia if we don't get some kind of deal. That deadline was last Friday. And last Friday came and went. One read of that is that President Trump was thinking, well, we're going to have this summit. And I'm not the only one who knows that deadline came and went. And so that would be a little bit of motivation, perhaps, for the Russians coming into this meeting in Alaska now.
Yeah, so I definitely think that there's a lot of opportunity, like Kim laid out, to put additional pressure on Russia. One of the really unfortunate things right now is how Russia is winning the resources war. I mean, early in the war, we really saw Ukraine using weapons as a force multiplier. It's a smaller army. It's got to fight smarter. And we've seen that shift a little bit. And I'm talking about in the skies in Ukraine, the way that Russia is ramping up production of Shahed drones, getting missiles from North Korea to batter Ukraine with. And then on a more small level on the battlefield, the use of FPV drones with fiber optic cables. Russia really has an advantage in production of those. And I think what Kim was talking about, some of the sanctions would be really helpful for getting rid of that resource advantage and kind of reversing this momentum that Putin has going right now. In addition to that, when I'm in Ukraine, I've been hearing about this really interesting idea called the Danish model. And the idea is basically that Ukraine is on the battlefield and it's testing weapons and it's innovating at the pace of war. And there are some things that Ukraine can produce more efficiently and maintain better that are produced in country. So Denmark actually ended up starting this out, giving Ukraine money with checks to make sure that it's going where it's supposed to be going to help enable Ukraine to build its own weapons. And unlike Europe, I think one of the weaknesses throughout this war has been that Europe's let its defense production facilities atrophy, so it can't manufacture weapons as quickly. Ukraine is in a really enviable position as far as the West goes, in that it has more capacity than money to make weapons. So I think one important way that we can kind of put additional pressure on Putin is to support Ukraine's weapon industry. And that's an idea that I don't think has gotten enough attention.
Kim, on the point about Trump trying to go to this summit to feel out Putin, notable that one person who will not be at the summit, not invited, was the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. And obviously, you can't have a ceasefire deal. You can't have a peace deal, anything that is lasting, without buy-in from the Ukrainian leader and the Ukrainian people, ultimately. And so what's your read of that? I mean, I take your point that maybe Putin now sees this as an opportunity to drive a wedge between Trump and Zelensky, between the U.S., which is supplying a lot of weapons and material to Ukraine, and those Ukrainian defenders on the ground. On the other hand, is that the kind of space that Trump needs to try to figure out if there is any sort of possibility of getting to any sort of deal with Putin?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the notion of this summit is kind of ludicrous because, I mean, how can you possibly negotiate a peace if Ukraine isn't at the table? And for the record, NATO's future is at question here as well, too. Europe, more broadly, and in terms of this decision about this giant neighbor it has to its east and this zone in between it and Russia, and what happens to it obviously matters deeply and very directly to Europeans. So there's a lot of different players here that, in theory, ought to be involved in these discussions. I get the point about wanting to go and feel out Russia. And a piece of this that we have not discussed yet that I think is important and is likely also going to be part of these discussions that happen are whether or not we've talked about what Putin wants. But one question is, could there be anything that Putin wants even more than that? And apparently some of the discussions are going to focus on whether or not there could be some economic cooperation opportunities between the United States and Russia. Some of these mineral deals, is there some way to get Putin to realize that his world might in fact be better if this conflict was not going on, even if he doesn't achieve his ambitions of a Ukraine puppet state. And that's a possibility. And, that's where Donald Trump is a deal maker. That's why he's bringing that with him in his arsenal of things to talk about. But I mean, we'll have to see. I think the important part here is that this is being laid out by Trump as an initial feel-out meeting. And he has said that Ukraine will be invited to the next one, if there is a next one. Europe will be involved too. That certainly seems to be the way Europe and NATO is dealing with it. The sort of NATO view on this is a setting of the table situation, a way to coordinate all the many different actors, and that the next steps will have a lot more input if there is a next step.
Jillian, we'll give you the last word, but when you're in Ukraine and speaking to Ukrainian sources, what is the kind of resolution that they imagine for this war, or the kind of deal that they think that they could accept, something that is, realistic in terms of land being given up, or in terms of a security guarantee that would allow them to feel like they can sign some kind of deal that is worth the paper that it's going to be written on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some flexibility in that they're not willing to give up their land, yet if they can't claim it back by force without admitting Russia's right to it, it's possible that you could leave the front line around where it is, with the idea in mind that Russia will change at some point and that land is still on the table. I do think, though, that they are pretty convinced that Putin wants Ukraine, and they're pretty concerned, and I think rightly so, that if Russia is welcomed back into the global community, if it has its sanctions removed, if it gets economic opportunity, that Putin is not going to use that for the betterment of Russians. They think he's going to use it to build his war machine and make another try. And that's why security guarantees are really important. They haven't given up on NATO. They view that as an issue of national sovereignty, as much as it is a security issue, that you shouldn't have Russia giving a veto on their foreign policy or the West's foreign policy. But I think what they're really looking for is, if the pressure of the war ends, how do we ensure that the West is still invested in protecting Ukraine? So they're looking at weapons. I think there would be potential interest in European peacekeepers as an idea that's been floated. But it's the question that I think needs to be answered through these negotiations from a Ukrainian perspective is, how do we make sure Putin doesn't do this again? Because he's been trying to do this since 2014. Before that, he did it in Georgia. And, you know, at some point, force is the only thing that they think is going to stop him. So you can either do that through deterrence or you can do that through fighting. But through diplomacy, there's skepticism.
Thank you, Jillian and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.